was a freshman in high school, and I was in Spanish class. And I remember my teacher came in, taught the class as usual, and then when the planes hit, I guess, they called her out. She was on a phone call and came back in, and she looked very disturbed.
I was watching Today's Show, doing some work. I work from home, and all of a sudden they break in and show this airplane had gone into one of the towers.
I remember that I was working in France and driving to the airport, and I heard on the radio about it. Not understanding a lot of French, but certainly understanding that there was something very big happening.
I was in third grade, and I remember my teacher asking the class if we had any parents who work in New York City, and I was trying to brag and say that my dad used to work there, not realizing about it.
What I remember is leaving work feeling very confused, nervous, anxious.
The immediate concern of not really knowing what was going on. You heard initially there was an attack on the World Trade Center and then later on the Pentagon, so I thought, we're under attack.
When I got home that day, my grandmother was watching TV, and I remember I asked her, "What movie are you watching?" And she said, it's the news.
When I think of September 11th, 2001, I remember walking to work at Radcliffe, where I was then dean, on this achingly beautiful fall day. One of those days when you think maybe you just got your glasses prescription enhanced because the world looks sharper than you could imagine it could be. The contrast of that beauty with how that day unfolded, I think, is something that has remained in many of our minds ever since.
Well, I think we're all a little more apprehensive in terms of certainly in airplanes, but even in public spaces sometimes I think people are probably always have their eyes and ears open.
Travel has become much more difficult. I think a lot of people don't care to fly anymore, and I don't think it's necessarily because they're afraid that something's going to happen on the flight, but just because of all the precautionary measures that are taken now, I think flying is just more uncomfortable.
Despite it being one of the worst things to happen on our soil since Pearl Harbor, I think that unfortunately people have used it to sort of divert attention away from some of issues that I think are equally as pressing.
It has us brought globally more together because the US has been much more impactful in the world through the consequences, the Iraq war.
I think there's more xenophobia. More people are wary of difference, and I wish people would open their hearts again.
I've kind of been sheltered and probably wouldn't ever think of that happening, and it opened my eyes to the realities of the world.
As a professor at university, as an academic, as a scholar, as a reader, has been very important because it has thrown up a huge number of controversial and contentious issues. Where does torture begin and terror end? But the most important lesson for me is that we have asked these questions persistently through the decade, despite the disaster. And that is the sign of a democracy.
I think a lot of us don't feel safe anymore.
That's probably the biggest thing is you think the United States is invincible to anything, and that day changed that, nobody's invincible.
And on a day-to-day basis, honestly, it doesn't really affect me too much. I will say that I have certain views, and that's just me being an immigrant. Not every immigrant that comes to America is a terrorist. A terrorist doesn't really have a profile. It could be anyone. 3
of my best friends, actually, now that you mention it, went over to Afghanistan and Iraq, and one of them actually served twice. My friend John came home. He got blown up by an IED, his Hummer, so he lost part of the use in his leg.
9/11 changed all of us. It changed our lives in ways that range from how we think about security at the airport and how much time we have to leave before a flight, to our real questions about what is the place of the United States in the world and what kind of vulnerabilities does this nation have that we once thought it didn't. How do we think about our relationships with communities beyond ourselves? And how do we sustain our commitments to our fundamental values and yet defend them at the same time? Values of freedom of speech, values of freedom of association, things that are the essence of who we are as a nation and a people, and yet issues that are challenged by the need to also be secure and safe as well as free.